Thank you for joining this next part of our IP webinar series. I think everybody's connecting to audio. Today, we are joined by Dr. James, or Jim. We became close friends before y'all joined, McParland. And he is going to be reviewing drug development patents and filing strategy with us today. He is an intellectual property lawyer and is a member of the chemical, biotechnology, and pharmaceutical practice. He counsels a diverse international clientele to create, enforce, and defend intellectual property rights. That includes patent preparation for both US and foreign prosecution, due diligence, and preparing opinions on freedom to operate, patentability, and invalidity. He has experience in the areas of small molecule chemistry, pharmaceuticals, polymers, batteries, and medical devices. In particular, he has drafted and successfully prosecuted numerous patents spanning small molecule cancer therapeutics, imaging agents for cancer, and combination therapeutic and diagnostic compounds for both treating and imaging cancers. We are very excited to have him with us here today to walk us through those drug development patents. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, you are welcome to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask them as he goes through his slides, or you can drop them in the chat and I can raise them up on your behalf. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Jim. Thank you so much for joining us today.
No, thank you. Thank you all for your time too. And I do mean it, if you have any questions in the middle, just feel free to ask them. This is meant to be conversational as much as it can be. I understand that it's law. Law maybe isn't conversational to most people. That means most people are sane. But what I'm here to do is be the translator between science and law as much as we can, because this is about what you can do as a researcher in terms of the patenting field, like keeping your mind open to it, because your focus is, of course, supposed to be and is on research. So patenting is just one part of a puzzle. It's not the end all be all. It's a part. Part of what this conversation is about is here are the things you can key in Tulane's Office of Intellectual Property Management about, so that they can keep a finger on the pulse of your research and know when they can chip in when patenting or something else might be important, and also to prevent other things that you might otherwise happen from unintentionally happening. And so that's really the focus of today, is what is it that we're trying to do that is helpful for you? And what is it that, you can do, hopefully short work on your end, that makes Tulane's, IP office have an easier time understanding your research, knowing when to jump in, knowing how they can help. And so, disclaimer, I'm giving some high level advice. This isn't particularly legal advice. You understand that this is like a legal disclaimer. Again, I promised you we weren't going to spend a whole lot of time on law because law is boring, but let's get to the facts of your science and research and how these apply to law. And so just what I want to talk about early on is just, what all is in a patent? What are the requirements in order to get a patent? Patent prosecution is the actual fight in front of the patent offices, be it in the US or foreign, in order to get that sort of type of patent, if you can. And then really more down to the nitty gritty for you, what's your practical guidance on what you can do with your research and development that might lend itself to IP, that might make it easier so that Tulane's office can know what your research is and how it can plug into IP. Always questions answered. There'll be a break at the end for questions, but just feel free to ask at any point in time. And so what a patent is per se, you may have already know this, is that a patent doesn't give me a right to do anything. All that the patent lets someone do is stop someone else from doing that thing. And so that means that you have to go sue that person. You have to bring them into court. You have to sue them to say stop. You might try earlier on to say, hey, look, we have a patent. You should really stop doing what you're doing. And hopefully they'll, say, oh, okay, sorry. But if you really want to enforce it, you got to threaten litigation. And so what that right is to make someone stop making, using, offering for sale, or selling. You might say offering for sale and selling. I don't know if there's the same thing. Well, of course it's law, so there has to be a distinction. And importing what is covered by the patent into the US. And so again, what a patent is considered good for is as a commercial tool. It's not an assessment of a really important idea or concept, it's not even a commentary on that, because some of the most important research concepts are something that is considered unpatentable subject matter. It's more to protect the research and development of a product or process that comes from research, to prevent others from copying without your authorization. And as a bargaining chip towards cross-licensing, oftentimes you'll see a patent used as. That can be where it's really valuable, as opposed to enforcing and threatening litigation. It can really help increase the value of your other patents, your patent estate, for your research and development, for your lab, or for Tulane as a whole or some other company. And so when Tulane's Office of Intellectual Property Management or any other like business looks at, going with a patent and what they're going to do with it, whether they should pursue it or something else, they want to see, is this something that aligns with certain goals that they have in mind? Like, what's your long-term research plans? What's the short term? What's a product right now? What's happening in the future? Because part of it is you don't want to over disclose in a patent. You don't want to give away your research plans so that someone else can run with them and use it against you. And part of the things they assess in what to do with research development and whether they should use IP or not is the likelihood of success in gaining a granted patent. And what would that granted patent look like? And part of what that patent would look like is, how could I assert this against someone else? What I mean by that is, there are things like methods that I could patent, like very particular methods, but because an outside observer couldn't tell if someone was doing the method or not, they might not have that much impact. It's hard to enforce or know if anyone is really impacting or violating that patent. So that might be something that they don't want to really pursue, or they might want to change the strategy on how they go after it in IP. Another one, it comes, and you might be more used to this in the field of like pharmaceutical products and big pharma, is the monetization value. Like, I have something of compounds that might go out there, be a pharmaceutical, that might have monetization value in and of itself. There's also other potential business rationale for filing a patent, sometimes in a defensive aspect to quote unquote salt the earth so no one else can do what I want to do. I mean, I might not think that I actually can get a patent out of it, but I'm kind of salting the earth so no one trips me up and tries to prevent me from doing what I'm doing or prevent your research. And so that's just a high level, some of the things that are being thought about when people are thinking about, why would I go after a patent versus something else? And so I have this slide regarding like what a patent, like the front page, looks like. What I really want to focus on is the upper right-hand corner, patent number. And so that's what oftentimes trips people up the most. If I see a number like this, where it's in the millions, where it's a number, commas in it, that's an actual granted patent. If I see a number up there that is like 2022 slash and then another number, what that slash means is that is not a granted patent. That is a publication of a patent application. And I say that because I can file anything in front of the patent office and they'll eventually publish it. That doesn't mean it's a granted patent. That doesn't mean that the patent office or anyone else thinks it necessarily has merit. But as a matter of law, they'll publish the applications that were filed in almost every circumstance, unless you do something very special. And why I say that is, people will see things out there and they'll think, well, someone got a patent to this. Why can't I? And it's not that they got a patent. What they're looking at is a patent application that got published. So again, if it has a slash in that number up there, it's not a granted patent, it's a publication. And just as an extreme example, there was a patent application filed for a method to confer deific powers on someone else. So a method of conferring godlike powers. Someone decided that they should file that in front of the US Patent Office. And the US Patent Office published it. It had really nice figures and drawings in it. It never got granted, it never got issued. So just wanted to point that out. That's maybe the most important thing whenever you see a patent is it really granted or is it not? So there's a bunch of other parts to the patent. And a lot of times this is written in patentees, which makes it confusing. Because again, patents are something that seem to attest to being of science, but oftentimes diverge and go on its own way. So there's going to be an abstract, which actually may or may not pertain to the actual thing that is being protected by the particular patent. it's going to talk about field. There's going to be a summary. There's going to be drawings, description. But where the real heart of the patent is, of an issued patent, is the actual claims at the end. Those always come at the very end. Those are the things that define what you can go out and stop someone else from doing. And there's two basic types of claims. One is the independent claim, and that you will see as like a composition comprising comma, and it doesn't refer to any other claim. And that's the broadest, as they say, broadest scope. It may recite some things, it may not. It covers the most generally. After that, if there is something that refers to another claim, that's called the dependent claim, which means it requires everything else about the claim that it refers to, like the method of claim one requires everything in claim one plus what it's reciting right now. And what those inventions might be in terms of like what might be claimed in a patent is it could be an apparatus, a device, something that comes from manufacturing, a composition of matter such as a chemical compound or an antibody, or a method. And a method could be like a true method. It could be like an industrial process, like a process for upgrading fuels. It can be something like a kit, which is a collection of articles together. And so, again, the real important part is it really an issued patent? That's a number with commas in that upper left-hand corner on the front page. And the next most important thing that you need to look at is, because the first page is rather granted. Second is what was granted, and those are the claims. Now, in terms of like what is going to be assessed in terms of like where your research development should go, should we protect it as trade secret? Should we try to patent it? Things that go into that calculus are what is asserted when you're trying to obtain such a patent. So does it meet legal novelty? Does it meet legal obviousness and inventive step? And what I mean by legal obviousness is that legal obviousness is, again, different than scientific obviousness. And then something that we're listing as enablement and support. These are things that the law requires you to put in that lets someone else make what you're trying to claim and shows that you actually made it and fully engaged it yourself. What I'll come back to is that the different jurisdictions, US included, don't want to give issued patents to what they call research plans. They want to give patents to something that you've shown by some way, shape, or form that you actually invented in some fashion. That seems a little diffuse, but I'll get back to it. And so one of the things that might hurt is that you'll hear about like grace periods, like my own publication, my own article can't be used against me in getting a patent. That's not quite true. There is a grace period in the US. Certain other countries have other grace periods, but they actually aren't the same. So in Europe, there is a very narrow grace period, but it requires you to file first in Europe, and it also only applies if I present it at the World's Fair, which was several decades back, or there's some sort of very narrow abuse or presentation. And again, what a certified exhibition is the last certified expedition was the World's Fair. So it's an exceptionally narrow window for you to exclude what you've already put out there. In the US, it's only after I show that somehow that is these inventors and not someone else. And that can become an issue if other people on, let's say, the research article are involved and made some sort of contribution. So you might not be able to remove that. And again, after I get past a year, it doesn't matter if it's 100% my own. It's considered quote unquote prior art and I can't get rid of it. So these tend to be very narrow. They tend to be, even in the US, they tend to be very limiting. So it's one of the reasons why Tulane's Office of Intellectual Property Management asks you, like, just disclose things that are coming up, disclose talks that you have coming up, let them know about papers that you might be submitting, because that way they can get in front of it early. So they can prevent something from being used against you in the future. Should you want to pursue something, or there might be something from your research that could be protected by patent. And so again, where some of this comes into play is, you know, what happens if, and this is something that's encountered. I publish something, I put something online in bioRxiv, and then I give my journal submission in if several months later, and then the journal publishes online after the provisional is filed. What's the key date here? And a lot of times what we'll hear is, well, the journal didn't publish till December 30th, 2021, so that's the date we have to go by. That's when things were published, disclosed. As it turns out, under law, because bioRxiv is immediately available on the web, that's considered the disclosure or publication date. And you'll hear those used interchangeably, but it's the public disclosure date. And so that's the key date you'd have to go by. And oftentimes, people don't know that something that has happened is considered a disclosure. So again, it's one of the reasons why Tulane's office asks you to, hey, let us know if you're going to give a poster presentation or give a talk or put something online. There's even certain journals that, while they have a online publication, I'm not just talking about ACS or other ones, but certain ones that will do like they'll call them preprints, or they'll early online availability of articles, and that's considered the publication date. Sometimes they'll even throw out a author manuscript early. It's not considered a journal publication by the article, but the author manuscript before galleys, before you've done any revisions, will be available online, and that's considered the publication date. So again, things to be cautious of. And again, things just to know, so you can contact Tulane's office and say, hey, I'm doing this, and just pass it along, and then they can make the decisions. When it comes to obviousness, again, this is like legal obviousness. It's almost offensive sometimes to call things scientifically obvious, because there's reasons research are being done to it. Legal obviousness is different. And so that can be what, in terms of legal standards, is considered that someone in the US, ordinary skill in the art, might have some motivation to do, and then would reasonably expect to be able to do it. And then legal language, because what it means is that what is considered legal obviousness is bigger and broader and a lower bar than what otherwise might be considered obvious in terms of like research, development, and making of new drugs, things like that. Other countries, what their obviousness / inventiveness is actually even harder standard. China might be maybe one of the hardest ones, in that it wouldn't have to be not easily made by someone of ordinary skill in the art, which is different than having a motivation to make it and reasonably expecting an outcome. China seems to be on the flip side. Like, you have to show that it would not be easy at all to have done that. I don't have to show that someone would want to do it. I don't have to show that one would have expected something to come out of it. I unfortunately have to show that someone wouldn't easily have done it. So it's more difficult in a jurisdiction like that. One of the things that comes about too is, if more data is generated after the filing, can I use that to help, and how can I use that to help? When it comes to obviousness, there are certain jurisdictions like the US and Europe where, yeah, I can submit that to show that, hey, while I only exemplified these certain, let's say, compounds as having these effects, I made other compounds. I went back and I showed that some of those other compounds also had those amazing effects too. Japan doesn't allow that. China only allows that under such restrictive circumstances that they essentially don't allow that in most cases. But that can only be used to show non-obviousness due to like some sort of, let's say, surprising advantage that wouldn't be known. So what helps for Tulane and anyone else is, when you're giving your disclosure, invention disclosure, or talking about your research, is not only showing the experimental data, but what's the advantages, and how is that tied to the data? Because having that in the first instance is going to help things throughout. It's going to help even Tulane set up how they might want to continue interacting and pace out your research, because they have your research plan in front of them. What's difficult is if there's an advantage that is said to have happened, but there's not data supporting it or not sufficient data. But again, disclosing early to Tulane lets that conversation happen as to when we should put the mark in the sand as to when to move forward with a patent or protect it as a trade secret or something else. And always, when it comes to these advantages, they have to be commensurate with the scope of the claims. And that's a fancy way of saying I can't claim every compound that might fall under this. I can only claim the antibodies, let's say, that I've shown that have this effect, some reasonable shadow around those. I can't go as broad as possible. Another way of saying it is I can't protect the concept. I have to protect something more concrete than that. So just kind of knowing that going in. And again, with that post-filing data that we just talked about, that can help for obviousness, but it can't take care of other things that might be required in terms of data. If the data wasn't there to begin with to support that there'd be these advantages, most jurisdictions, the US included, will not consider it. They'll say that at the time you only speculated that there'd be these advantages, and we're not going to give it to you now because you happen to show it later. And so that's part of the timing aspect in terms of getting disclosures over to Tulane's Office of Intellectual Property Management, so they can look at these things early and say, how can we pace this out? And so one of the ways that that comes into is sometimes people want to submit post-filing data, like I've now run these experiments and they show that this works, when what is going to happen or what is being thrown against them is the fact that the office or an application is being challenged because they said, you claimed every compound with this core, but you only showed 2. And even though you came back after you filed the application and showed all these other compounds you can make, you didn't have that in the original application. So we're not going to give that to you now. You didn't support that entire scope that you were going after. So we're not going to give you that entire scope now because you later made it. One of the ways that you can help against that is providing details on like how to make such compounds, but generally you have to have, it's on that second big bullet point, some variance, of peppering the landscape with the different items that you think can be covered by the claim. Like if it's a method and there's several different ways you can perform the method, you probably need to have some sort of data evidence showing that these different ways work, provide the same advantages. And one of the parts about the patent is that you need to show how to make and use the invention. Let's say that I put in a list, and I've seen this before, a list of all the compounds. I'm using compounds because I'm an organic chemist, right? But it covers all the experimental data showing, characterizing them, showing that they're actually made. And what happens is they don't put in any experimentals describing how the compounds were made. They're just showing the evidence that we have these compounds in hand. A patent has to show how to make and use the invention. So even if I put in all the compounds showing I had possession of all these different compounds to get this large scope, they won't give you the patent because they'll say you didn't show how to make it. You didn't show how to make any of these compounds. You need to guide someone, give them the ability to make the compounds independently. And that's part of the deal with patent too, is I'm basically giving to the public the means of making this in the hopes that I will be granted a patent. And for a certain amount of time, I can stop anyone else from doing this. Because I have to show how to make and use it, because I have to show that I have actually or been able to make everything under the breadth of what I want to claim, what can be an issue is if you put in things that are outside of that. Like I want to have a claim to all these cores with these compounds. I don't have a claim to any antibody that combined to this antigen. I say that because the law has changed the past 10 years. I used to get a claim like that, and now you cannot. Because they consider that either, and this is from courts, a half-baked idea or a fishing expedition. In fact, Supreme Court case this past year came out with regard to an antibody claim, and they said you only made a couple antibodies. The rest of the stuff you showed how you could make them, but you didn't. You just made it so that everyone else would have to do this for you. This was a research plan, a fishing expedition. This is not a valid patent because it's too far beyond what you actually showed and was able to show someone how to make. So these are the considerations that have to be taken into account by Tulane's office in terms of what should be patented now versus what should be like held off to the future. How much do we discuss in a patent now versus how much do we discuss later or want to put later, so that we don't publish something that we can't get, because then again, you've published your research plan and that can be used against you in the future. And part of this entitlement to having this and being able to move forward, and I bring this up because of basically a fiction that got out there when provisionals were allowed under US law, is that if I need that in an actual patent application, it turns out I need all those items in a provisional as much as I can. So there was an idea that came out that I could just file a provisional application that just, is one sheet, termed like a cover sheet provisional, or just slap it on to some ideas, and that will guarantee me that date as my priority date, against which after that, things aren't considered prior art. So the provisional can be really bare bones, and that's enough for provisional because we can file the full application later within a year. But the problem is, if you don't have all that support in the provisional, it won't be granted to you when you actually go to convert it. Both the US and foreign jurisdictions will actually look at the provisional and say, well, you didn't describe, or you didn't even show support for making all these antibodies. You didn't show support for this method or this assay. You just said that one should make it, and then you never had any experimentals. You never showed how to make it. So you're not granted that provisional's priority date. You're granted the date where you filed the full application. And oftentimes what happens is in between the provisional filing and filing the full application, an article, research article, or a presentation came out, and that's used against the applicant, the inventors, which is why they challenged that provisional date. So that is why when a disclosure is given, like when you give one to Tulane's office, they're probably going to look and say, well, what do we have now? What can we do now? So yes, while I can do more experiments to like flesh things out more in a later non-provisional application, they want to make sure that there are pieces in the provisional that give you the support, that give you that discussion of making and using, that will actually allow you to have that fullness and be given that priority filing date for the later non-provisional application. And again, one of the things that helps with navigating like what do we draft now versus what do we do later is including as much data as possible regarding the technical effect, pointing out like what's surprising, unexpected. Understand that you can discuss like future research plans, but that post-filing data might not be enough, even for a provisional. That if I have something where let's say for one particular antibody, I get something really surprising effect, I might not be able to go after anything else if I've not shown that those things also don't have a surprising or unexpected effect. This is true not only for the US and Europe, it's especially true for like Japan and China, where they look at your working examples and they try to drill you down to just what you've actually made and actually demonstrated. That's an extreme, but it helps because it is almost a guiding post for how you also need to approach the US and Europe, where they won't be that exacting in many circumstances, but they might get close to it when you're saying that this is a surprising advantage, or this is an advantage in treating cancer, because they consider cancer a very big, broad, tricky area to actually functionally treat. So describing that at the first instance helps lay the plan out for how we might go about protecting this one way or another, patent or not. And why, some of this says is that what happens is there's a lag between when you finally file something and when things start getting picked up again and discussed. And so in the US, I mean, this can be anywhere from 2 to, and I don't put the longest instance here, 6 years. So there can be a long lag between when you filed something and done all the research, and then when you suddenly pick it up again, when the patent office picks it up again, and there's a discussion about, well, this is what's happening, this is what we want to drill down to, this is what they're trying to push us towards, like what's happening in your research right now. So making sure that Tulane, the attorney, like know what your future research plan is a way to help not only with the patent, because it's going to happen years after it's going to be picked up and looked at and fought over, but also helps with making sure that what we file right now doesn't implicate your future research efforts in a way that your future research can't be patented. Also, some of the considerations that we made by Tulane or others when like filing a patent is like, what are we doing with it? Are we trying to go internationally? Do we just want to go US? Because again, there's that delay, which can help with getting licensee buy-in, getting other parties to get attracted to your invention you put out there. But there's also the consideration is like, what are the costs that are going to be associated? So with PCT, that can delay some cost, get some additional interest. But you're also looking forward to what other individuals, what other aspects of your research might be coming to play in the next few years. Well, the PCT, they'll give you some sort of research report and written opinion. They're generally very high level. So sometimes people will see these research reports and they might look really damning. And they'll say, oh, it's horrible that we were rejected. Yet again, they're given a very little amount of time. They give you kind of a barometer as to what a patent office might think, but they're not the final word in anything. And so also understanding what is going to be examined by different offices is part of what's happening when you talk and disclose your research to Tulane and what might happen in a patent. And I put this in the PCT side, but it applies to the other foreign jurisdictions because there are some things that both the PCT or other foreign jurisdictions just won't look at or won't consider viable a viable invention, quote unquote, that can be patented. They just won't allow it. In China, anything that might be performed on a human, that is, you cannot patent anything. Like any method, anything that might be performed on a human, they will not allow it. There's a number of other jurisdictions that'll do that too. In the PCT office, you might get that initially. It's like methods of medical treatment being one of those examples. So that can sometimes be an indicator as to what your foreign outlook might look like, because foreign patenting is extremely expensive. And so in the first instance, Tulane, you, others want to know, what can I actually pursue in these foreign jurisdictions, or should this be more US? That's part of the calculus that goes into it. Just kind of as an indicator of cost. These are kind of the price tags that you're looking at least before. There's been like Europe recently has raised a lot of its official costs. Canada just recently, and by just recently I mean in the past month and a half, raised some of its official costs. So these are the costs you're looking at before you might actually get a patent. These are just estimates. So that's why there's a lot of this front end work to figure out what should happen, where this should go. Again, talking about like how long it happens before, even they pick up an application and start looking at it versus how far things might be out in the future before things are patented. That's one of the reasons why there's this discussion about, hey, can we talk about the advantages? Can we talk about where your research is now, where your research is going? Because there's this long pause between when you actually file the patent and when it actually gets picked up and starts moving. And so we, Tulane lawyers, want to make sure that what we're going after is of value now and in the future, but we're not overdoing things so that we say things that we can't get, but that you later might be able to patent if we hadn't said it. So that long-term research plan is important for us. And so the real nitty-gritty, what helps if you give something over to Tulane's Office of Intellectual Property Management, what's going to help with your research development so that you know that they can see the items that are in your research development, that they can pinpoint the things that maybe you didn't even see that might be valuable and give you something that you can work with as a strategy and help protect things moving forward. And so sometimes what's considered an invention, again, is that product, method of use, and improvement. This isn't necessarily for you, but if you have these in mind, this kind of lets you see the buckets that things might fall in. And maybe that will help you just put things down. In terms of these patentability aspects, and especially enablement and possession, as I have in that list down there, knowing what studies you've done and what studies you have planned is extremely important. It's really helpful to let Tulane's office know about that and the attorneys know about that. Like not just proof of concept, are these cell cultures, are there animal models planned or have some already been done? Like how far along are we on this? Is that, again, extremely helpful. Or if they're planned, a timeline is, we think this is going to happen the next year, or maybe we're waiting on funding and we don't think it's going to happen for the next 6 years. It gives them that timeline so that they can know like where are we at, what can we go after now, what should we go after later. And oftentimes because you are the experts in your field, like a lot of information about what the business case is, like why you are doing this research because there's a reason for it generally. What is the space? What is the new problem that is being solved? What is the advance that's happened? What is it that's already out there that's ineffective that this is providing an advantage over? These are the things that you really help because you're experts in this field. Inform Tulane know, and anyone else that is looking, so that they can start making that business case for your research development on the patent side. And as part of making that business case, again, like I said, not everything, again, because patent is not science, not everything that might be of high scientific merit might be patentable, but there's other ways of taking care of it. So it might not be that Tulane wants to go over a patent. They might consider something more of like a trade secret, or just keeping things quiet for now so you can go after them later. So it could be that this is something that may or may not be easy to reverse engineer. That is, if someone sees the finished medical device, is it easy for them to come back and figure out all the pieces of it and do it themselves? Well, that's the case where probably it's better to patent that. Don't, just send out the product and to the market and then people are just going to do it and copy it, and suddenly your hold is gone. If it's a method that is like, this is how we are identifying these clinical leads in-house in our research lab, that might be something that's really hard to enforce on the outside. You could go after a patent for it on this method, on maybe even the program, the computer program that you're using, or the AI that you taught. But at the end of the day, I can't see from outside the building, someone else is using that method to identify these leads. That's your secret sauce. And we can't go after anyone else who's doing it by a patent. So maybe that's something that we talk about keeping under wraps. And part of that conversation might be too, like what goes into your publication experimentals. What should we say? What should we not say? What can we help out with so that we can protect that, so we're not giving away that secret sauce? And so when these, forms that you submit or whatever you submit to Tulane's Office of Intellectual Property Management go in, like things that are also really helpful is like, here's the relevant data and figures that we already have. Generally, you're probably already presenting something, you had internal lab meetings, or there's something there that you can present what that data is. What's your funding? Because that's something that Tulane actually has to report out to the government itself, is like, this was the funding used for these inventions. And also, again, I've said this multiple times, I say it again, like what's happening in the future? What's your future plans, your ongoing experiments? And, when do you think you might see results of that? Because having that holistic picture lets us come in and help part out, like, this is good for patenting, you're going to publish this. That's great. It's publish or die, of course. Maybe we can hold off on this aspect and not try to patent it now. Wait until you get these other experiments that you've planned, and that'll let us go after a patent in that instance. Things like that to really help you so that we're helping you as opposed to you're feeling like you're doing stuff just for patenting, because that's not your goal as a researcher. Also, what's really important is anytime you've discussed this technology or invention, be it at a poster presentation to a colleague or a collaborator, what was discussed, and if there was a poster itself or material, like either indicating it or providing copies of what that was, because that's important to know when a public disclosure may or may not have occurred. Again, because what is a public disclosure can sometimes be a legal consideration on what is quote unquote public. Sometimes it just keys into who the collaborators might be, where another institution might want to have a say. And again, if there's any upcoming dates, like we plan on submitting this to this manuscript, that lets us know that there might be a deadline by which something needs to happen or some decision needs to be made. As you already do, maintaining detailed laboratory records, that's not only helpful for inventorship, but what's really helpful is what are the things that didn't work? And a lot of times when things are being provided, people like to give the stuff that did work. But we find is really important when it comes to a patent or anything else in IP is the stuff that really didn't work enhances the fact that the stuff that did work is a surprising, non-obvious, patentable thing. That this thing, despite these other things failing, that these things, that this nexus, that this subset worked. That's oftentimes extremely helpful in putting forth a business case as well as a patentability case and to get that issued patent. The other part that will make stomachs churn on the lawyer and office side is when there's been a discussion and someone says, well, there was a confidentiality, a non-disclosure agreement, and I signed it, and that was fine. And it's like oftentimes those are one-sided, and often Tulane requires you to send that to Tulane's Office of Intellectual Property Management before sharing anything that's quote unquote confidential info. And you can pretty much consider things that are confidential info, research that you've not yet put out there into the public. So any research, any updates, like that can be things that are confidential info. And oftentimes the agreements that someone else will provide you are very one-sided. Several of them from big companies you'll see where they have it and they'll just let you sign it. Thankfully we have these NDAs for you to sign, and you sign them. And what it says is that you can't disclose anything of the companies, but they get to do whatever they want with your stuff that you told them. And even when you do have a great confidentiality agreement, let's say proofed by both sides, they're not bulletproof. A breach is something that can happen, and then you can just you have to sue to get damages. So knowing what and this is high level, this is something that Tulane's office would review. But when it comes to like who does it protect, like what's the company, who's the receiving party, who's the disclosing party, is this mutual? Those are the things that are looked at, because that's oftentimes where this rises and falls in terms of success and whether it's actually protected or not. So these agreements, again, I put a big flag on them because they got to be looked at by someone else, because oftentimes the real details are tucked away in language such as receiving party, disclosing party, and what the obligations are. And that's when you want Tulane's office to be your friend and pour it over and say what's going to work and what's not. Part of that's going to disclose a definition of what is confidential information. That's another gotcha they'll have. Sometimes they'll say it's only confidential if you provide it to them in writing with the marking confidential on them. But what they wanted was to just have a conversation with you over Zoom, and you threw up a bunch of slides. Well, because you didn't mark it as confidential, they'll say, oh, none of it was confidential, so we get to do whatever we want. Again, one of these traps that I just want to alert you to, which is why, Tulane and us IP lawyers oftentimes take a long pause, because we want to see what is written into those NDAs, into those non-disclosure agreements, so that we know the details and can tailor it to what's actually going to happen. So I've said this too many times. I'm sure you're sick of hearing me saying it. Tulane Office of Intellectual Property Management, they're wanting to help you. They want to know your research because, not only do they want to know what your plans are and where things are going, it helps prevent, heart attack moments where something's already gone out the door or a bad agreement's been signed. And that's just going to save stress on everyone's side, yours included. So on this slide, which you'll be sure you've been getting copies of, if I understand it correctly, is where you can submit invention disclosures, your Tulane IP office contacts, Sam and Matt, and then that general Tulane patents address for inquiries about disclosures and other questions about IP going down. And again, said it too many times in this talk, prior to submitting anything like grant submission, abstracts, poster presentations, a discussion with another institution, like contact Tulane's office, they'll really appreciate it. And oftentimes, they're going to spot something that they can dodge easily in the first instance. And timing, sometimes things happen and things get last minute, but giving that future plan, what's coming up, always helpful. The more timing, of course, helps in getting that full picture and getting you as much as possible. Because when time constraints are short, it's hard to do a whole lot. So we come back to, traps for the unwary. It's always about these like deadlines, which when I talk about deadlines, these deadlines are triggered by when something is made public. And so if that happened without, Tulane's knowledge, there might be a way of salvaging it, might be a way of rescuing it. Other times there might not be. So the whole deadlines aspect that we have to be watchful for always comes back to like what's going out there, who you're talking with. And hopefully that can be easily communicated. In terms of like a disclosure, who has done what, who you collaborated with becomes really important. That ownership aspect, like who are you talking with? And the collaborations that you've had might have a co-applicant that doesn't impact that anything moves forward. It just has to be put in on the front end. And when it comes to licenses, if you think there's a license out there that lets you use something, that's just another thing to talk with Tulane's office about, because that license might not cover what you're doing with it. Material transfer agreements sometimes will tuck in licenses. So again, that's where you bring in Tulane's office of intellectual property management rather than just signing that maybe some other office of your collaborator sent you. So be especially aware of those. And sometimes you might need to talk with someone to say, or I'll say always, you'll need to talk with someone to say, what does this license let me do? I want to do X with it. Well, let me do X. So a lot of this was high level, but a lot of this was about you giving information that you probably already have on hand. Like, what's my research? Where's it at right now? Where do I hope to go with it? And who am I working with? And what have I done in terms of getting it out there, posters, presentations, stuff like that? And what I plan on doing. And that's the information that Tulane's office needs to say, hey, we can make a patent out of this piece. Or maybe we like pause and we wait until you go to that next stage of research that you said you're going to do. And that's where we can patent it. Because really they want to partner with you to do this in the best way possible. And so with that, I know we have about 9 minutes left. And so I wanted to make sure I left things open to questions. I know this was kind of fast on the what's a patent side. I try to be more slow and deliberate on the what is helpful on your side aspect, but any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
So, Jim, this is Matt.
Hey, Matt.
Hey, appreciate you taking the time today to walk us through this. I don't want to go too in the weeds, right? But one of the challenges, at least in your space, is trying to chart a course, right, for an initial discovery of maybe screening hits, right, and then taking that forward to protection of kind of 2.0 IP, right? To the extent you're doing, SAR, and then coming up with the first grouping of, medchem design, compounds. For a university, right? Obviously, that's a challenge, right? Trying to protect a first bolus of IP, right? With leaving room for compounds to come. Obviously, in a startup setting, that has significant challenges too, right? Because you're trying to give service to your initial IP, right? That you might feel like is at a level that could be advanced to the clinic, right? But you only have a certain amount of money to give justice to a first filing and then planning for a second and third family down the line, right? Obviously, that would hopefully be backstopped by new funds that would come in, right, and be able to support more IP procurement. What is your, if you have a recommendation, how should one view that initial bolus of IP, right? I mean, what is there a cutoff in your mind in terms of activity that would say, hey, maybe you take this outside of the US, or maybe you just stay in the US for this set, this is your initial core, you wait till you meet this threshold. Do you have a recommendation or sense of like where that inflection point is as far as activity for a specific set of compounds where you say, hey, this is worth maybe ex-US protection?
Right. So generally, and it's very general, and you already know the whole
Yeah.
lawyer speak. This could change based on the circumstances, but general is once you're in the nanomolar, like no low nanomolar range, that's a nice, easy, clean point where you can say, okay, going forward is this is a good time to think about going forward. Whereas if it's in the micromolar range or like extremely high hundreds of nanomolar range,
Yeah.
that's a much harder case to make. And then there can be, if that's the case, that's when we talked about that layered approach that you know of and that I mentioned in the talk, where maybe I go after a certain set right now, but I don't over disclose, I don't overshare in the application or hopefully any other publication about 2.0, about what my next projects are. So I can go after this set now, which seems really promising, maybe only the US, but that's a lead in to investor interest, where under some sort of confidentiality agreement, there can be discussion about where 2.0 is. This is what we currently have under 2.0, and we're developing more to garner that interest. So staging it out in that fashion. But in terms of like a cutoff between US only, or maybe let's say patent only and national, generally what we tend to see is that low nanomolar activity for a compound. There's one exception for a set of compounds where it was micromolar, but that's because it had extremely high toxic threshold, and there was every other thing in the art out there actually couldn't even get to micromolar at that time. So it was the only thing out there, and it was expected to go higher than that was considered almost impossible. Getting to micromolar in the first instance was considered something completely surprising. But that was one specific example. Yeah.
Okay. That's helpful. And again, in that early stage, right, limiting the scope of your disclosure, at least not, going over your skis, right, to the extent you have screening, trying to not show structures, right, early on, right, giving an invitation to folks to pick up where you've left off. Perhaps they're a little, in a better position to move quickly, right? So the idea that you're giving away your research plan and your research results if you don't have to, right? If your biology is what's interesting and it's less so the chemistry, at least from, your lab, obviously don't display all the chemistry just as a value add. You want to keep that in your pocket as much as possible with a view towards collaboration, or at least us getting to a kind of a second step on that, chemical design and next steps as far as the, post-screening activity.
Right. And I think that comes back to like the patenting being a commercial strategy and not a evaluator of scientific merit.
Yeah. And I think that's been largely successful, at least in our experience at at the University of Kansas, right? And the idea that you're not you're not disclosing more so than what is needed to get that, paper accepted in a journal. I think that
Right.
is in many cases best strategy, because there's just a lag between, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 of any kind of medchem project.
And let there be a phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 of different patent families that actually came from it. Yes.
Yeah,
Yep.
100%. Yeah. I guess as it relates to, maybe the piece on know-how, right? What you can, retain within, your lab, right? Within a university kind of competitiveness, grant kind of focus, or to the extent in a company, right? You're obviously having to make measured investments in terms of what's worth patenting and what's worth, keeping as business know-how, more or less, right? To the extent that you have that, I would assume you come out on the on that with what is enforceable, right? Like, what can you detect from an infringement standpoint, right? What can you prevent others from doing, right? Practically speaking, right? So if you can otherwise make an item, right, you can track its production and manufacture. If it's a process or method, it's obviously a little bit more challenging. So that is patentable IP, right? But it's something that I'm sure, your university and corporate clients are a little bit less likely to pursue independently, at least as far as method or process, because there's just really an enforceability issue. Can you kind of speak to kind of the business judgment on that side, at least that you see from a client perspective, in terms of,
Right.
well, how often do folks chase that independently, and to the extent you have a view on what sectors they chase method or process?
So method or process, you might see a lot coming out at a university level from places that are putting it out there and they shouldn't. I'm going to be very blunt about that. So things may or may not get granted. Some do, some really don't. But the ones that are more successful, you'll see in terms of like overall patent grant, they don't put a lot of those like method only, process only applications out there. Where I oftentimes see the ones that have more valuable method or process patents, those are things that I've described before as I can see what they're doing from a plane. Like I fly over it and I can see. So one is a fuel, basically changing a non-food plant and animal resource, more like non-food plant, into fuels that are chemically indistinguishable from gas, diesel, jet fuel, except that they end up being cleaner. They have less sulfur and stuff like that. Most of those processes, I can see that they're using like a large reactor. I can fly over and see where some of the pipelines are going. I can see that they're buying certain equipment independently. And so those are methods and processes that have value have more value in terms of a patent, because I actually can see what's happening from the outside, albeit indirectly, but I can see and have a feel that what someone's doing in a very easy fashion. So it's those sorts of processes that tend to be, they're considered higher value in terms of a patent landscape. Now, some of those places too, when there's like an internal conversion that you can't easily find a resource for, there's not a specific catalyst you have to buy, they will keep those as trade secret or know-how.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I mean,
Okay,
that tracks, right? That tracks, right? Like, that's when you go independent, right? You can have something led by a process or method, set of claims, to the extent, you have those. Otherwise, it tracks with like a composition or device or something, right? It's a method of making, it's a method of using.
But in terms of like what a lot of your researchers are doing, like maybe they have a program to help identify leads, or a certain way of identifying the highest potential for further screening. A number of our clients at our companies do have that, and they do keep that in-house as confidential and secret. While you could try to protect the algorithm or as a computer method, they don't, because they said we're putting that out there, and we know that that'd be extremely hard to enforce. But this shows us how we get our leads. In fact, their entire company is built off of this internal program that identifies leads, and they don't, with our advice and taking it, they don't put any IP on that, because that would necessarily make it public, not patent IP. Their IP is in trade secret and keeping that under know-how and wraps. And they're a pharmaceutical company. where that aspect of them is, I'll say, hidden.
Yeah. And
Hey,
for
y'all, I'm so
guessing,
sorry to interject, but I do want to just note that we are at time. We love this engaging back and forth. We're really appreciative. Thank you so much, Jim. This was really wonderful. I think you spoke, you translated Patentese, I believe you referred to it as,
Yes.
for our research community at Tulane, and we're very grateful for that. I really quickly want to highlight some upcoming programs and events that are happening in the ecosystem. So on February 16th, right after we all recover from Mardi Gras, there is a Pitch Friday happening at the LePage Center. If you are interested in applying for the Pelican Cup, the entrepreneurship competition at U of L, that is a statewide competition, those applications are due on the 25th. We will have another IP webinar on March 6th about trademark and branding. Our friends at the Taylor Center on March 8th are going to have a Design Thinking 101 workshop. And then finally, we are all looking forward to New Orleans Entrepreneurship Week, which is falling in line with Tulane's Book Fest the week of March 11th. I'm so sorry to cut that short. We really appreciate your time today, Jim. It was really wonderful. I feel like I learned a lot. And I think you were really great at distilling some complex topics for us to understand.
Hopefully, but I aim to do better and better each time. So any comments, any questions after, happy to take. And yeah, other than thank you again for all your time, everybody. And I hope you have a great day and a great Mardi Gras. So
thank you. I hope you stay warm enough up in Wisconsin. And thank you everyone for joining the Institute today for this series. Have a great afternoon, everyone.